Well, why don't we get started? My name's Tom Banchoff. I'm a professor of political science here at Georgetown and director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this, the second panel in our symposium on Catholics, Evangelicals, and the American Future. Not everyone was here for the first panel, so just a little bit of background. Since 2006, Georgetown has partnered with Eastern University to convene a dialogue on Catholics and Evangelicals for the common good. There have been annual meetings, and this year we're getting together to continue that conversation, to work on a book, an edited book that brings together some of the strands of the dialogue. But we also thought it made sense to use this opportunity to share with a wider audience what it is that we've been up to with the dialogue, and also to link some of the themes of that dialogue to what's going on in our society and, of course, with the upcoming election. So during the first panel, my colleagues John Berkley and Ron Sider, who co-convened the dialogue, gave you a kind of inside look at the themes that have been discussed, and sure enough, you saw in the question and answer period that the contemporary scene, the fact that it's election season, burst in already. So in a way, we've already begun the conversation we're going to focus on now, which is Catholics, Evangelicals, and the 2012 election. The idea there is to work off of the headlines, sort of the story as we know it, do some handicapping, well aware that nobody really knows, I would say, how this is going to play out, but we've already seen a couple of key issues surfaced, a couple of obvious ones, the evangelical side, the question of Romney as a Mormon, what that means, not just in terms of voting preferences, but enthusiasm and turnout. On the Catholic side, the conflict, the open conflict between the Catholic bishops and the Obama administration on the HHS mandate. Interesting polls showing that that may or may not be already having an effect on the preferences of Catholic voters. Lots of other issues from the news cycle we'll want to bring into our conversation, but I also hope we'll take a longer view, as our colleagues did in the earlier conversation, place Catholics, Evangelicals, in the public sphere and in politics in a broader historical context, going back to the 70s, 80s, 90s, if not before, but the three distinguished public intellectuals we have here and journalists can at least take us back that far, I think, because a lot of this we've seen before, and one of the interesting questions is what's new, what's fascinating about this election cycle as compared with earlier ones. So just a couple of words about our panelists. Everyone should have access to a fuller description, the biographies, so I won't go into any detail. I think it's also true that the panelists are known to the vast majority of you. Just very quickly, E.J. Dionne on my far left, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, also a university professor here at Georgetown, well known as a Washington Post columnist, and has a new book just out that I'm sure he'll tell us a bit more about, Our Divided Political Heart. Literally just out this week?
Last Monday.
All right, so fresh that we don't even have a stack in the back to hawk for you.
I should have arranged that, actually.
We should have, yeah. Next to him is Mike Gerson, also a columnist at the Post, known to many of you as an author, a public intellectual, a speechwriter for George Bush. His most recent book is The City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, that he co-authored in 2010. And to my immediate left is Margaret Steinfels, again, known to many of you as the longtime editor of Commonweal, one of the most important, I think we can say, progressive voices within the Catholic Church. You edited, I believe, 15 years?
I did.
Yep, 15 years as editor-in-chief there, and also co-founder of Fordham's Center on Religion and Culture. So we have some different perspectives here. We want to make sure to leave time for conversation, as we did with the last panel. So I've asked each of our panelists to provide some introductory remarks. If you say 7 to 8 minutes, that usually helps to keep it under 10. So let's try to do that. Maybe we'll have time for some back and forth on the panel before opening it up for a broader conversation. I'm going to recall to your memory three sets of questions that I posed just to get us thinking along some of the same lines. They're questions that I've already hinted at. They're questions also mentioned here on the program. Not questions I expect us to adhere to and go through in any systematic fashion, but as more of a framework for our conversation. First set of questions is about how we see the campaigns already going toward the general election positioning themselves, if they are indeed, with respect to the evangelical and the Catholic vote, and the wider question of whether those labels still mean anything in 2012. One of the themes already of the earlier discussion is how divided each of these communities is along many issues. Second set of questions is how far apart are these groups, Catholics and Evangelicals, from one another? How divided are they internally? And then I threw in a third question, which I think also gets back to the genesis of this particular dialogue, Catholics and Evangelicals for the Common Good. I ask it as a political scientist, but it's also a very political question. Why does religious and ethical controversy continue to center more on culture wars issues than on economic and social ones, even in our current climate? So I want us to at least come back to that, even if it doesn't get brought up in the preliminary remarks. So thanks all for being here. And with that, I'll hand it off to EJ.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here. And I want to thank Tom Banshaw, who's done some really, really wonderful things with the Berkley Center. I'm also honored to be with Peggy and Mike. I've said for many, many years that I read Peggy Steinfels because she tells me what I think. And so I'm at a disadvantage here having to give a talk before Peggy speaks because I don't know what I think yet. So but I will do my best, Peggy, and you can tell me how I did.
I'll correct you.
Yeah, you will. And you have for a long time. And to be here with Mike Gerson. Mike once wrote that he often felt homeless in the traditional camps of American politics. And while I think it is truly wrong of me to profit from the suffering of others, Mike's homelessness is what keeps bringing me back to the column. And watching your journey, Mike, has been really instructive for all of us. And I'm just very grateful to be here. I also want to thank John Borelli for answering a question I've never been able to answer for your life. John Borelli, for those who came late, is the convener of this, one of the conveners of the Evangelical Catholic Dialogue. And I never knew until today exactly what your title was. And so now I have an answer to the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a special assistant for interreligious initiatives. That is one of the coolest titles I have ever heard. I'm a Catholic, so I'm not supposed to have scriptural references, but I was thinking, in my Father's house there are many mansions, and among followers of Jesus in the United States there are many political clubs, headquarters, cabals, and political machines. But the more proper scriptural story may actually be the one about that Tower of Babel. And I'm going to come to it at the end, the multiplicity of voices that claim to speak in the name of the gospel, in the name of Jesus, and how somehow they often seem to be speaking an entirely different language, even as they speak from the same scripture and the same, broadly speaking, the same traditions. And when I say Babel, I'm not just talking about what pundits like Mike and I speak. Let me just go to sort of the hardcore political question. I think that stasis is more likely than great change when we are talking about how the religious groups we're talking about today are going to vote. I think we could say quite clearly that white evangelicals will vote overwhelmingly for Mitt Romney, that African-American evangelicals and Catholics will vote overwhelmingly for Barack Obama, that Latino evangelicals and Catholics will also vote for President Obama. White Catholics will vote marginally for Mitt Romney, and Catholics as a whole will vote for the winner because they always vote for the winner. Now, some may ascribe that to the Holy Spirit. Others might say it has something to do with the diverse demographics of who happens to be Catholic. Nonetheless, it is a fascinating fact about American politics that of all the religious groups in the country, Catholics tend to consistently pick the winner. But to say that we're going to have a kind of more or less what happened the last time doesn't really tell the story, because what really matters is more or less, and that there could be substantial change at the margins. That is to say, a few points either way could make an enormous difference. So we'll take first the question of evangelicals. Sally Quinn raised the question earlier, will there be a cost to Mitt Romney because of uneasiness with his Mormon faith among evangelicals? The short answer is his Mormon faith will not prevent him from winning an overwhelming majority of evangelicals because, A, they are overwhelming, white evangelicals, again, I emphasize, because they are overwhelmingly Republican and seem really not to like President Obama. And for many of them, the calculation, not to be too bald about it, will be, I'd rather have a Mormon than President Obama, even if that's what it takes. The question is, will there be any change at the margins? And in particular, not so much will there be any kind of shift toward President Obama from the last election. I do think turnout could be an issue for some evangelicals. And the most interesting observation I have heard on this question came from Richard Land. Many of you know the leading Southern Baptist figure, very smart about Baptist politics. And he made the observation that if he looked at his own mail and the talk about Mormons, he tends to get the most hostile comments from Baptists who live in Mormon areas of the country. And that's not surprising that we all have the greatest conflicts with the people who are near us. I won't elaborate on that. We could ponder that in many different respects. But we tend to argue with the people nearest us. And if Richard Land is right, that would suggest that if there is a turnout effect, or if there is any kind of anti-Mormon effect, it might take places in the states of Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Idaho. Utah and Idaho are not relevant to the outcome of the election, since if Barack Obama carries them, he's also carrying Mississippi and Alabama, which I do not predict he will. On the other hand, Arizona and Nevada could get very interesting. Nevada is certainly an important swing state. Arizona might become an important swing state. I think you are going to see the Obama campaign be very reluctant to make any issue of Romney's religion. I think you're going to see Republicans take apart any Obama campaign statement to act as if they are making Mormonism an issue. I am hoping that both sides will have restraint on this question, but this is not an election in which we can expect a whole lot of restraint. And I might add that I am very worried about the impact of Citizens United and the independent spending in the campaign, because all kinds of issues are going to be raised by these third-party groups in a completely unaccountable way. Candidates, even if they profit from them, will be able to say, I had nothing to do with that. And it'll be curious to see if it happens, if these issues are raised at all. Among Catholics, I think I just want to make one brief observation. The biggest swing within the Latino community is within the evangelical Latino community. President Bush in 2004 carried, depending on who's counting, somewhere between 40 and 44% of the Latino vote. But he carried Latino evangelicals, who represent about a third of the Latino community, by a very substantial majority. In 2008, partly because of the way, not so much because of the way John McCain handled the immigration issue, in fact, not at all because of how John McCain handled the immigration issue, but because of how the Republican Party, other than President Bush, handled the immigration issue, there was a massive move toward the Democrats, and President Obama carried the Latino evangelicals. I don't expect a big move this year, but if you're going to see it among Latinos, I think you're more likely to see it among evangelicals than anywhere else. But that brings us to Catholics. And we have had talk of the forthcoming Fortnight for Freedom and the agitation around the contraception mandate. And I think that we don't know yet, A, whether the Fortnight for Freedom and the way the bishops handle the religious liberty issue will become highly political or not. There are some of us who worry that this could end up looking like a partisan campaign, even if many bishops don't want that to happen. I think there is a substantial minority in the bishops' conference that is either hostile to or highly critical of President Obama. I've heard estimates of around 35% of the bishops. So I think some of this will vary diocese by diocese in terms of the kinds of messages you hear from bishops. And speaking on from the more progressive Catholic point of view, I am very worried that this religious liberty focus could be used to push Catholic social justice teaching to the rear and to have a whole new set of issues up front. It doesn't mean that the bishops won't continue to criticize, say, Paul Ryan's budget. It doesn't mean they won't continue to stand for social justice. But in terms of where the muscle of the church and the money of the church gets put, I think one of the questions will be whether this religious liberty issue gobbles up a lot of the church's public commentary and public energy. And then the question becomes, what effect does this actually have on the Catholic vote? And I think that what one could be looking at is a move of a few points within the Catholic vote among Latinos and white Catholics. A few points among Catholics can mean a great deal. And I'm not ready to say that as a prediction, nor would it be clear if there were a little bit of movement among Catholics of that sort that it was directly attributable to this campaign. Economic discontent could have something to do with it. But you can bet a lot of pollsters after the election are going to look at mass attending Catholics and comparing them closely to what happened in 2008. I think that is going to be a central question here. I just want to make a couple of other observations before I pass on to my colleague Mike. One is I do think there is we're at a fascinating turn where a great many Christians, both Catholic and evangelical, seem to have pulled away from their long-standing kind of communitarian commitments, as I would see it, and embraced a sort of individualistic approach to the economy that is, in a sense, out of keeping with the broad Christian tradition, is certainly out of keeping with the Catholic common good tradition. But I'd also argue that over the long haul, it's out of keeping with an evangelical tradition that included William Jennings Bryan, that included a strong voice for social reform, a strong voice against slavery in the 19th century in favor of better ways of dealing with the mentally handicapped, with public schooling, and that you've seen the rise of a much more libertarian approach to economics. Now, I have puzzled over this for a long time, and Mike, I would love to hear Mike comment on this. And I've come to the conclusion that a lot of it is driven not by theology at all, but by politics, and that's where I want to close. But I do think that that something can be explained by how you answer a question about your relationship with Jesus. And I am struck that a certain evangelical approach to Jesus involves explaining his importance by saying, Jesus changed my life. And another approach to Jesus is to talk about how Jesus changed the world. Now, these two are not mutually exclusive. I suspect Mike is someone who would say both of those things. And yet, I've thought that a certain style of evangelical theology may now easily elide into a kind of individualism, which is historically distant from where a lot of evangelicals were, and I toss that out for people to make observations on. The other thing I want to say quickly before I close is I think younger voters in both of these communities are quite different. Among younger Catholics, I am very fearful that the church is simply losing large numbers of moderate and progressive Catholics altogether, and it's something I would like our bishops to think hard about as they proceed in this election. Ex-Catholics are now, I believe, the third largest denomination in the United States. This means that I think a preponderance of younger Catholics over time, that is to say 21 to 35, may turn out to be conservative because they will be the only ones left. And that would change the character of the church quite radically. I have a good friend who's a conservative in Opus Dei, who supports this view in a certain way. She once told me, I'm not worried about the future of the church because our kids are becoming priests and your kids aren't. And there is some real truth to that, but that tells us something about the future. Among younger evangelicals, I think there's a great ferment going on. I think that younger evangelicals are very much engaged in social justice work and environmental work. They voted, a majority of younger evangelicals voted for McCain the last time, but about twice as many of them, 15% among older evangelicals, 30% among younger evangelicals voted for Obama. In other words, the proportion voting for Obama was twice as large as among older evangelicals. There's something interesting going on in that community for the long haul. I want to close on a note about this dialogue, and it really plays off something that both John and Ron Sider said. I am more and more concerned that we are not defining ourselves primarily in religious terms when it comes to politics, that actually political commitment is now prior to religious commitment, and that people are kind of backfilling and rationalizing where they end up on so-called religious questions or on so-called religious questions on politics, not for religious reasons, but because of their own political views. And it's something C.S. Lewis actually wrote about this. And that is not always a terrible thing. Sometimes one should not, sometimes it's perfectly appropriate, maybe most of the time it's perfectly appropriate to vote primarily for political reasons and not from our religious convictions. What I fear is that we're mixing them up in a way where we're pretending to vote on our religious convictions when we're actually voting on our party or ideological or cultural convictions. And I think we need to be a lot more honest with ourselves. And I'm not making a critique of right or left or center. I'm saying that's true of us all. And I think it's something we really have to come to terms with. And so, to the future of this dialogue, I think it turns out that bringing Catholics and evangelicals together is relatively easy. I think bringing Catholic and evangelical Republicans together with Catholic and evangelical Democrats is getting more and more and more difficult. And I think that one of the questions to ask is whether political and religious and theological ecumenism is a much tougher lift than political ecumenism. And so maybe in the future, especially after what will be a very bitterly contested election, it is hard to see either candidate at this point, although a lot can change in 5 months, winning by more than 53% of the vote. The odds are pretty good. It could be less than that. We'll be a very divided country still. And so maybe we should start thinking about how our shared religious concerns might equip us to help bring the two sides in our political fight, if not to love each other, then at least to stop despising each other quite as much as they do now. But even saying that requires an enormous leap of faith. Thank you.
Let me start by reacting to one thing that E.J. said. I've been pretty much involved in this evangelical Catholic dialogue since the beginning, since we convened it. And I've benefited from getting to know two people in this process. I benefited from getting to know John Carr and Ron Sider as people who have very strong political views, but for whom ideology is not primary, and for whom ideology is not a barrier to fellowship. And so I've personally benefited in many ways from seeing an example of that. These are some exceptional people, and that in itself is a contribution. And there are many other, it could be said of many of the other people involved in this effort, people who are willing to take on their own team when the demands of conscience lead them in that direction. And that is particularly rare in our political environment, and it needs to be more common. I'll just respond to a few things before we get into a discussion. I find myself in fairly rare agreement with EJ on a lot of the analysis part here. It's nice to begin on a kind of a level ground of agreement. In this, what we're seeing right now, I would add a few elements, but if you step back 20 years, you have seen both the evangelical and Catholic vote in America. Now, you can disaggregate that in a variety of different ways, but white Catholics and white evangelicals have become more Republican over the last 20 years, both groups. Okay? Evangelicals, their support for Republicans, whenever it has peaked higher than the previous peak. And it achieved its highest point in 2004 with George W. Bush. There are troughs in between, but this is a group that's firmly anchored in the Republican coalition. I think there are a variety of reasons for that, but it's become more Republican over time. White Catholics, I've seen a similar dynamic, but a smaller one with more variation from election to election. At least, at every spike there, it's often been a little higher than the previous Republican spike. In particular, you've seen a dynamic where people that attend church more regularly, more committed in their tradition, have voted more Republican over time. You also see a dynamic by which the numbers on regular attendance are higher among evangelicals than they are among Catholics, which I think skews some of that data. This election is very much in flux. Evangelical support for Romney is not where it was with George W. Bush in 2004. It's about what it was with John McCain in the kind of 73 to 75% range. So that's good, but it's not anywhere near kind of the Republican high end when it comes to that. There is among evangelicals an intensely unfavorable view of Barack Obama. There is not a commensurately intense view in favor of Mitt Romney. And there are lingering concerns, I believe, on Mormonism at the margins. But I think we also have to take seriously that some of the concern is a distrust of how committed Romney is on social issues because of his background. So some of it is not just religious, but also a distrust on culturally conservative issues in this context. White Catholics are a majority in support for Romney. I talked with John Green earlier today on a different issue. He says it's higher than the norm right now. And he was making the case, which is an interesting one, that in the polling that Catholics are actually the most favorable religious group to Mormons. And that was true in the Republican primaries, and it's true more broadly. And he says that that's a cultural memory of the way Catholics were treated in American life. And so there's a much closer identification with Mormonism than there is among evangelicals, which could be an advantage to Romney that's an unexpected advantage, and which he saw, of course, when he was running against two Catholic opponents in the primaries and regularly got large majorities of the Catholic vote in the Republican primaries. So that's an interesting dynamic. Talking to John just about what he thought was taking place among this subset that could be quite important that you're talking about in Ohio among regular church attenders who are Catholic who consider themselves independent or Democratic leaning. There's not a lot of good poll data on this. He says his anecdotal impression is that they're deeply conflicted. Okay? that there's a significant concern about religious liberty issues and the way that those arguments have moved forward, and a significant concern that Mitt Romney has no rooting in a social justice argument or tradition. Doesn't talk about the poor. So there's his anecdotal view is that there's a significant internal conflict going on there. And as you say, this could be important. We've got a national election that will be largely decided on economic issues. That's what people report overwhelmingly as their main electoral concern. But that does not mean that various groups of voters in key battleground states cannot assume disproportionate importance in the context of a close election. And that could put cultural issues very much in the fore. And that could be on both sides. A lack of enthusiasm by evangelicals in Florida could make a difference, okay, as far as turnout and other things. Or a concern among church-going independent Catholics in Ohio or Wisconsin or Iowa or Pennsylvania or a lot of other places could make a significant difference. Now, I'll proceed to say something a little more controversial, just to add a little element here of disagreement. I think it's fair to say that 4 years ago, that Barack Obama consciously set out to fight that long-term trend of the sorting of the parties by religious intensity. So that he made specific outreach to evangelicals. His call to renewal speech was really one of the best of its type that he gave at Jim Wallace's group. It was really an excellent effort. He, I think, made significant outreach to Catholics as well. His tone was a unifying national tone. And he made marginal gains. I think you're right. You don't make dramatic gains from, for the most part, unless there's some defining issue. But he made marginal gains in both of those groups. I think that there's very little evidence right now in the electoral process that the Obama campaign is fighting that long-term trend. In fact, I think that some elements are embracing it. So you see I forget his first name, but Heilman in his New York Magazine article, Tom Heilman, coming out recently, about how some operatives within the Obama orbit are influenced by this idea of demographics versus economics, okay? That they want to ride, essentially, the growing, what's called the coalition of the ascendant, which is minorities, socially liberal, college-educated whites, especially women and young voters. And so David Plouffe has a quote in this article saying, "Let's be clear what Romney would do as president. Potentially abortion will be criminalized, women will be denied contraceptive services, he's far right on immigration, he supports effort to amend the Constitution to ban gay marriage." So another operative says, he's the 50s. He's retro, he's backward, and we're forward. That's the basic construct. If you're a woman, you're Hispanic, you're young, you've gotten left out, you look at Romney and say, this effing guy is going to take us back to the way it always was. Okay? I'd make a couple of observations about that. One of them is that that's the definition of a culture war argument, dividing people by culture war issues. It's Romney that wants to talk about economics in this election and, in fact, constantly tries to avoid engaging on these type of issues. And so, second, I think that the evidence is that David Plouffe and David Axelrod are not engaged in a particularly sophisticated outreach to religious voters. There's not much for more traditional or conservative evangelicals or Catholics to find that's encouraging in the current discourse and agenda of the Obama campaign. Not very much to make people feel welcome. And I think the worst crime that they're engaged in is making EJ's life more difficult in trying to explain these trends. But that to me is the question is whether the Democratic Party is fighting these long-term trends by which the parties sort by ideology and religious intensity, or whether it's contributing to them. And I'd make the argument that we've entered a phase where at least a significant portion of the Democratic Party has decided that the coalition of the future is not the New Deal coalition that included white Catholics and evangelicals, many evangelicals. And maybe that's a realistic recognition, but it might have consequences in Ohio and other places that are hard to foresee. I think I've taken my time, but I'll respond to one other thing about what some of the trends within evangelicalism that I've seen, and why there is a serious appeal, for example, to the Tea Party and some other elements here. So, our dialogue is very important, but not representative in a certain way, because there's a significant portion of the evangelical community that, if you look, for example, in the Iowa caucuses, the most recent Iowa caucuses, a significant portion of Ron Paul's support was evangelical in Iowa. So I would only respond to just to open a discussion that I think that there is this history that EJ talks about. I went to Wheaton College. There's a room at Wheaton College. Jonathan Blanchard was the abolitionist founder of Wheaton College. There's a room at Wheaton College that was intended to be the throne room of Christ when he returned, because he was a postmillennialist. And he thought that by acts of social engagement and fighting slavery, and he also fought for blue laws and against secret societies and a lot of other things that were popular among evangelicals at the time, that he was helping to usher in the kingdom. And it was not an individualistic view. But that changed really significantly in the fundamentalist modernist controversy beginning in the 1920s, which was really the breakup of the liberal coalition, okay, between people like William Jennings Bryan and more secular liberal elites, where secular liberal elites turned with a vengeance on evangelical engagement. People like the journalist Jack Reed, or the Clarence Darrow, or others. And you had a broad retreat of evangelicals from public engagement. And when they re-entered politics, they had a different political history. And they reemerged in opposition to government intervention. So the first big issue for many evangelicals was the attempt during the Carter administration, an evangelical president, to regulate religious schools. Okay? And it was not abortion initially that was the driver for a lot of evangelical outrage when it came to this. But then came Roe v. Wade, and there had previous school prayer decisions, and it created a deep suspicion of government involvement that is not really true of Catholicism in many ways in the political history of the United States. And I still see that all the time. When I push on issues like development assistance, support for development assistance, evangelicals they often have the institutions that implement development programs, World Vision or other things. They have a deep sympathy for those concerns, and they also have a deep suspicion in government's role. And so I guess my response would be that, to some extent, the argument is not, the basic argument there is not theological, but a matter of political philosophy. And I don't think that evangelicals have effectively defined a political philosophy that allows a positive but limited role for government. And it's one of the real challenges in approaching a lot of these different issues. But just some random thoughts.
Thank you.
Wow. I'll get you all later. I decided that I would try and stick to my time and wrote down what I wanted to say. And the first thing I want to say to all of you, as I'm sure you know, that last Sunday was the Feast of Pentecost. That is the day when Christians celebrate the presence of the Holy Spirit. That would be the third person of the Trinity. And those who did make it to church may have been reminded, as I was, of the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, which are virtues that Christians are to practice in their daily lives. And to refresh your memories, these virtues are wisdom, understanding, right judgment, fortitude, knowledge, piety, and fear of the Lord, or reverence. I went to Wikipedia, the common good source for information, who told me that Catholics and Protestants have somewhat different names for these virtues. But contemplating that list of virtues brings to mind the last several months of controversy between the Catholic bishops, and I would rather say some Catholic bishops, along with some other religious leaders, and the Obama administration, or some parts of it. The U.S. Catholic bishops, who have long been practitioners of those virtues, at least in my lifetime, which goes back into the last century, seem to be neglecting them at the moment. And while we wouldn't expect the president and his officials to be virtuous in quite the same way, it seems to me their lack of prudence, or in political terms, political cunning, in the matter of the HHS mandate has been pretty astonishing to many people, including me. This is a controversy neither church nor state needed to have or should be having. But why are we having it? And as you all know, and you probably all possess many conspiracy theories that explains why this, why now. But today's discussion is not particularly about why, but how. How will this or other things affect the 2012 election? How are the campaigns positioning themselves for evangelical vote or the Catholic vote? On the Catholic vote, let me quote my friend to the left, EJ, "There is no Catholic vote, and that's why it's so important." There is a Jewish vote, although we could argue about whether it's really a religious vote. There is probably a Mormon vote, and it appears there is an evangelical vote, but not a Catholic one. And EJ's point, which has been made up here by everyone, is that Catholics don't vote as a bloc, but tend to vote in more or less the same way as the general voting population. The Catholic vote may be critical only when they are swing voters in swing states. We've heard Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin mentioned, and we might throw in Pennsylvania. In any case, I do not detect that the Obama campaign has yet shown any particular positioning to secure the Catholic or evangelical vote, or the vote of any particular religious group. The faith-based office in the White House has been quiescent since 2008 and seems to be staffed by people who haven't demonstrated any particular wisdom or prudence on the subject. Perhaps the Obama campaign does not think that the religious vote is more significant in this election than the economy, unemployment, the Latino vote, the women vote, you've heard it all here already, ending the ground wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and not starting any new ones in Syria or Iran, at least before January 2013. This is not, in my view, an unreasonable view, nor do I detect that the Republicans have such a positioning strategy vis-a-vis Catholicism. I think they may be hoping that the Catholic bishops will do this for them. And we've had some discussion about this, but with a Mormon candidate at the top of the ticket, Republicans may be very wary of raising any religion questions at all. Rather than the administration positioning for the Catholic vote, it seems that the bishops, including the head of the bishops' conference, seem to be yearning to put the Catholic vote on the line. That is, the Fortnight of Freedom planned for later in June would seem to have elements that could rally conservative Catholics to Mr. Romney. The recent filing of multiple legal suits against the HHS mandate by some 40 Catholic organizations would seem to have the effect of keeping the mandate before the electorate, though the electorate may soon weary of the lawsuit, the ins and outs of the controversy, and of the bishops themselves. Second point, how far apart are Catholics and evangelicals on this issue? To what degree are both groups internally divided? Well, I think you've had a display here today that Catholics are divided on practically every issue that you could think about, that it is always risky, it seems to me, to say which ones. Perhaps it is prudent and more or less accurate to say that most intense divide is between some liberal and some conservative Catholics who are at loggerheads over both internal church matters and politics, though not necessarily in parallel with liberal and conservative Americans. There are, after all, pro-life Democrats. There are pro-immigration Republicans. And both may cling, good boy, they may both cling to the hope that, the consistent ethic of life, first enunciated by Cardinal Bernardine, may yet come to the fore of our political thinking. A majority of Catholics, perhaps the vast majority, are neither liberal or conservative in this sense, I think. Rather, their vote is probably conditioned on all the issues that we've mentioned already today, the economy, unemployment, inequality, college tuition costs, healthcare costs, immigration, depending on their age, region, and ethnicity. We do know that many Catholics, younger ones in particular, are put off in a serious way by religious leaders involving themselves directly in politics, such as telling them how to vote. Third, why does religious ethical controversy continue to swirl more around culture wars issues than around economic and social ones? And will that continue to be the case? It seems to me the culture wars have been dead over the last decade. And perhaps it is still dead. I think it is. It seems unlikely that many voters will choose their candidates on the basis of this particular culture war that the bishops have started. And I guess I've always been of the view, or doubtful about many voters ever choosing on the basis of the culture wars. The culture war zombie has come up in the 2012 election cycle because some Catholic bishops have raised it from the dead. Though the HS mandate at the center of the controversy concerns contraception and sterilization, the current objection by the USCCB is the definition of religious institutions, as John Carr quite succinctly told us, contained in the original draft regulations. Liberal and conservative Catholics, along with indifferent Catholics, in fact, rose as one in objecting to it in January. We said at our household, E.J. Dion and Chris Matthews. The revised...
We speak ex cathedra, of course.
The revised regulations seem to satisfy liberals but not conservatives. More likely, the bishops are throwing down the gauntlet over the future war they imagine over abortion and gay marriage, neither of which, of course, is involved in the HHS mandate on the table at the moment. It seems to me it is imprudent of them to have chosen contraception for their battle, as imprudent as the administration was in requiring Catholic institutions to provide it. Nonetheless, it is hard to see this brouhaha becoming the key to critical votes at election time. That's my views.
Thank you. All right. Well, we have a lot of issues on the table. We've got about 35 minutes. I was going to spend a little more time up on the podium. I think I'll ask just one question, though, before we open it up. And perhaps in responding to some of the questions from the audience, you'll be able to address some of the points you've made to one another so far. This is sort of a historical question about where we are. I'm struck by the fact, or puzzled by the fact, that one of the candidates for president, one of the nominees now to be, Mitt Romney, can effectively argue that my religious beliefs are not important for the way I run the country. What I believe theologically is disconnected, essentially, from my ethics, my convictions, my ideas about what is correct. that seems like if we look back the last 20, 30 years, that's a relatively new move in our politics. It seems to be succeeding. Is it succeeding because of a broader culture shift where people are really focused more on the economy and they're tired of the sort of personal politics of religion? Or is it succeeding because it's strategic for both sides for different reasons not to push him on this issue? The Republicans because they don't want to raise the Mormon issue, the Democrats because they're wary of bringing in religious questions. So I'd be curious on your reflections on that.
It seems to me there's a kind of strange irony. I agree with your notion that he is saying this will not affect the way I run the country, but it is pretty clear his religion deeply affects the way he runs his life. And there was a front page article in the Times a few weeks ago called Mitt Romney, Man of Faith, which could have been the counterpoint to John Kerry in 2004, not the man of faith. And reading it, I said to myself, there are a lot of people who are in fact going to be impressed not by how he will run the country, but by the fact that here is a man who seems to be deeply committed to his religious beliefs and practices.
Right, no, I agree with that. I think that Romney in the 2008 campaign made a stab at giving a broad speech trying to explain the relationship of his faith to his politics. And I thought at the time that the speech was a failure because it was really two speeches at war with each other stitched together. And it was part of the problem with a Mormon running in a Republican primary against a very strong evangelical candidate, Mike Huckabee. So the first half of the speech was essentially a John F. Kennedy kind of, our religion shouldn't be part of, my religion shouldn't be part of your calculation of how you vote. We shouldn't think that way. And the second half of the speech was essentially how Mormons believe in Jesus, how this influences him, and it was a straight-out appeal to evangelical voters. And the two halves just didn't work together. Now, in fairness to Romney, he was trying to solve at the time an insoluble problem, which is he desperately needed evangelical votes in the Iowa caucuses to come out of that. He hadn't decided to skip them. So he had to kind of play it both ways. Nonetheless, it didn't work. I'm struck by the fact he never tried to do that in these primaries. It's still not clear that Romney did all that well with this issue. He was lucky that he didn't have a really strong alternative. He was lucky that Gingrich and Santorum at times split things up. He never won a primary where a majority of the vote was cast by evangelicals while the primaries were being contested. I believe, unless I missed one, the last time I checked, that was the case. And as Mike noted, there's something very ironic that the Catholic candidate carried the two Catholic candidates carried the evangelical vote, Gingrich in Georgia and South Carolina, Santorum everywhere else, and the Mormon carried the Catholic vote. He took a bit of a stab at something more in his Liberty University speech, but I think that he is going to try to stay away from this. I want to reply to something that Mike said. I half agree and half disagree with him, but I'll wait till we get farther down the road. What?
Okay, maybe hold that for now, Mike.
Yeah,
did you have any
what I thought.
response to this?
Yeah, I would only add that I think that Romney, on his approach to public religion and his own faith, is really a reflection of modern Mormonism. It's not at odds with modern Mormonism. I think the Mormons have been deeply averse to being too conspicuous in political engagement since the 19th century, when a United States president sent 1/3 of the U.S. Army to repress them because they took heterodox views on a variety of topics. Beginning at that point, if you look at Mormon history, they have been when they incorporated as a state and other things, meticulously bipartisan, meticulously non-political. The goal has been not to raise their head too far above the parapet for the most part. There are a few exceptions, but not many. This is a church that has a statement read from the leadership of the church every year to congregations, to all Mormon congregations, saying that the church is officially nonpartisan. There's no other church that does that every year. Okay, so this has been part of their public profile for a long time. And so it's not unusual that Romney would take a view consistent with that, and I think that he's, attempted to. There's a huge distinction between some elements of more simplistic evangelical and fundamentalist ideology, which says we need to restore a Christian America. Okay, so they throw around their weight, as though they were the majority reclaiming its own. The moral majority. Okay? No Mormon would ever make such a claim, that they're reclaiming, a privileged place in American life. They have a much more pluralistic understanding of religion because they've been forced by history to have one. So.
Very good. I still think it's fascinating to be able to say, as a candidate for president, I have religious beliefs, I'm deeply religious like you, but there's no real connection, or let's not talk about how those religious beliefs relate to my ethics and my public policy views. So let's keep an eye on that.
He tried that once, and
he tried it and it didn't work. And there's maybe political reasons why it doesn't work, as we've discussed. All right, let's gather up maybe a bundle of three questions, then hear from the panel, go back for several more. We've got about a half hour to go. Please, there's a couple of roving mics right up here, Galen. Stand up and briefly introduce yourself and pose a question.
Hi, Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. A couple of you mentioned the idea that you see the bishops kind of picking a fight with the administration. And I just want to say that from the point of view of evangelical church leaders, though we may not get as much headlines as the bishops, so we're also equally concerned with the mandate, and from the point of view not that it deals with contraception, but that it tells churches that they have to do things that they believe are wrong, and deeply wrong. And just one clarification regarding, you mentioned, Peggy, the revised regulations, but in fact so far there aren't any revised regulations. There's only the original regulations that have been put into law exactly the way they first started out. And then there's been some public brainstorming, but nothing else. There is no revision that at least now is part of the law, just brainstorming. The other part to my observation would be, I'm surprised that none of you mentioned the president's comments on same-sex marriage in light of the effort or non-effort to reach out to religious people. Thanks.
Thank you. Right over here.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Hannah Claus. I'm a gynecologist, and I have to disagree with Mrs. Steinfeld's. Not only is the culture wars about contraception and sterilization, but about abortion, because a number of the contraceptives which are covered are definitely abortifacient, and I can speak to that as an expert in this area. So to say that it isn't so is trying to redefine when life begins. As you know, the definition of pregnancy used to be at conception. My trade union, the American College of OB-GYN, changed it to be at implantation, but we now know from immunological studies that the embryo at about the age of 1 day begins to react with the maternal organism, and I even have some information with me. So that doesn't hold anymore.
Okay, thank you. In the back. Is that Sally over there on the right? Yeah.
E.J., you mentioned Romney's speech about Mormonism, which you declared a failure, and I think most people didn't find it very successful. Michael, you talked about Obama's Sojourner's speech before he was elected, which was very successful. And Peggy, you mentioned the White House's, what we might want to call low-key, faith-based operation. Obviously, Obama and Romney have not made a decision about how they want to deal with religion during this campaign. I mean, we had the whole flurry about Jeremiah Wright a couple weeks ago, and people are trying to bring that back up, and everyone's trying to get Romney to talk about Mormonism, which he doesn't want to do. Why don't the three of you pretend that you're advisors to both of them? Do you think that either one of them should give a speech about religion, a definitive speech? Would that be a smart thing to do?
Okay. Well, we've got three wide-ranging questions. Why don't, Peggy, do you want to start? And please try to be as concise as possible so we can get back to the audience. Yeah.
It might be a smart thing for them to do if I thought either of them would do a job that would put the issues before the American public in a way, number one, that the American public would understand and would find compelling. As far as I can tell, neither of them seem to have themselves the wherewithal to do that. And I don't know, speechwriters, former speechwriters might know better whether there are people who could do that for them in a way that was convincing, but I myself don't see that.
Yeah, and I would only add that I have great respect for the speechwriting art, but on the Romney side, he needs policy that actually symbolize a concern for the common good, in my view, and I've been arguing that. He needs to make the argument about how conservative and free market ideas and whatever interventions he wants to do, serve the cause of the poor and vulnerable in society, which is not an impossible case to make. But right now he doesn't seem to have policies that symbolize that or have much interest in it. So I think that this is both a rhetorical failure, but there's a policy aspect to it as well. It's hard to advise the president on his side, because it really depends on whether his campaign based in Chicago has made a conscious decision to pursue a coalition that does not make traditionally religious people feel particularly welcome. Whether that's viewed as just the past, as an old coalition that we're getting beyond as we're moving into new political ground. I'm not sure everyone in the Obama White House shares that perspective. And then I would only add that it's from the evangelical side, relating to another question, one of the most interesting things about recent Pew polling on the contraceptive mandate is that about 68% of white evangelicals want aggressive carve-out for religious institutions for the policy. Okay? About 59% of white Catholics do. Now, that's an odd figure because evangelicals don't oppose contraception. Okay? They're essentially want to carve out for a policy in favor of Catholics, Catholic institutions, with theological objection they don't share to the practice itself. It's an indication, at least to me, that evangelicals take these religious liberty issues quite seriously, and they have a deep distrust for government in that context, and they're afraid the way the principle of this type of regulation is going to be applied in other areas. The precedent it sets in other areas. So I understand there's divisions even within the evangelical community, but they certainly view this not as in any way a fake issue. So
one of the interesting facts that I think has come out in this whole discussion about the mandate is that, and Kathleen Caveney pointed this out, the identity agenda of Catholics over the last 20 years has created the recognition that Catholic institutions identify themselves as Catholics in a multiple of ways, and they are not always the ways in which bishops want them to be identified. And one way to read this mandate fight right now is for bishops to assert their definition of the identity in the face of the fact that, for example, many Catholic colleges and universities indeed do have insurance policies that give their employees contraception, et cetera. So, I mean, this is part of the internal struggle as well as the external one. Sorry, EJ.
No, that's okay. That's an excellent point. I think there's a fact that needs to be put on the table here when we talk about evangelicals. We act as if every part of an evangelical's political panoply of political convictions has to do with their being evangelical. Fact is, even white evangelicals are disproportionately Southern and middle class and married. They became Republicans in the 60s. They switched to the Republican Party in the South in large numbers in the 60s for reasons having absolutely nothing to do with religion. It was about race and civil rights and the arguments we were having in the country then. And so if you looked at the voting patterns in 1964 and 1972, Wallace interrupts that because he got a big vote in the South, you already had this group as a conservative Republican group. So that I think, I was not at all surprised by that piece of polling data, because that view reflects a Republican view as much as it reflects an evangelical view. And there are more evangelicals in the Republican Party than there are in the Democratic Party. I just think that has to be put on the table, and it's a piece of it. It doesn't write off the importance of the evangelicals' religious views. It doesn't say, I certainly am not saying this is somehow a racist reaction back in the 60s. I'm just saying that we saw this happen, and it had to do with a lot of things that were going on, including civil rights. That's just a fact. I want to agree and disagree with Mike, and by way of also answering Galen's question, I agree that the Obama team has not done nearly as much as it could have or should have on religious matters since 2008. I mean, basic fact I always like to say is Democrats rediscovered God in 2004 in November in the exit polls. And since you can discover God anywhere, why not the exit polls? And they realized something went badly wrong for them in 2004. And so they did a whole lot of thinking and a whole lot of organizing, and a lot of groups were formed, some money was spent, and they really made an aggressive effort, as Mike said, to re-engage religious voters and to try to move those numbers a bit. And they did move them some. I think one of the problems is that once Obama was elected, a lot of people on the progressive side, the Democratic side, acted, well, that problem is solved, walked away from it. And there hasn't been much activity, nearly enough activity to keep that going. And there are a whole lot of different reasons for that. And which gets me to the answer to Sally Quinn's question, which is, I think my honest answer would be that Obama should give that speech and Romney shouldn't, in their own interests. Because I think Obama needs to re-engage this community, the religious community. I'm not sure that speech actually helps Romney do what he needs to do in this election. Where I think you're wrong, Mike, even though I think there's something to it, there are Democrats and Obama people who buy this new coalition, forget all these old folks who believe in religion and the like. There are 4 words that militate against that. Those words are Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Latino. And that you cannot, that strategy, and I think there are enough smart people in the Obama campaign who know that you cannot pursue a pure version of that strategy without getting yourself into a lot of trouble in those states and among Latinos. And to Galen, I would just say that I view what Obama did a little differently. I was very critical of them the first round because I thought they had to do some kind of accommodation at the beginning. I was completely shocked that they did not make any adjustment in the contraception rule. They realized rather quickly they made a mistake. If they had been pursuing the pure strategy, they wouldn't have even backed off that, I think. A pure secular, if you will, secularist strategy. But not only that, when you look at, I don't think it's fair to say, well, they haven't rewritten the regulations yet. The new regulation is supposed to be promulgated, what, in about 6 months. But they did, after they made the initial accommodation, put out new, new rules which further leaned in the direction of the religious groups, pointing out, for example, that the four-part definition, which I wish they hadn't done in the first place, was not intended as precedent. There was a lot of movement in those rules. And I think the real question to ask of the bishops, and I think it's a question they're asking themselves and they're going to debate in June, is whether a confrontational strategy is actually the way to get to where they want to go, or whether they should continue to see how much they can get out of the administration. Now, I have been told by a very reliable authority who happens to be in this room that they seem to show no willingness to move on the four-part definition. I have a feeling, though no knowledge, that there was a kind of deal made the second time around where they said to the religious groups and the Catholics, we'll move so you don't have to pay for it. And they said to the pro-choice groups, but we'll hold to this definition. And they were hoping to make that deal stand, which they saw as trying to compromise. You know, I don't know how much movement there will be off that. I think there is some pressure to move a little further toward the religious groups. But I cannot help but believe that there are, and I hear this not just from liberal Catholics, but from very knowledgeable people in the church, that there really are some bishops who want this fight with Obama, who don't trust the Democrats, who don't trust Obama, President Obama, and they want the fight. And I think we're going to learn more in the coming couple of months as to whether that view is going to dominate in the bishops' conference or not. And we're also going to learn to see how different bishops deal with the fortnight for freedom, because I suspect it's going to be emphasized far more in some dioceses than in others. And I think it's going to be dealt with in different ways in different dioceses. And so I think we're going to learn a lot in the next month.
Can I add one thing?
Very briefly, yeah.
Okay. Just because as the evangelical, I have to defend the bishops for some reason. But
you're part of the 68%.
That's right. Yeah. But this is a case where we learned in a congressional hearing with Kathleen Sebelius this last week that she asked for no legal judgment from the Justice Department before she made her decision, that she had no internal review process on the constitutionality of this decision. It is not just irresponsible, but offensive, the way this administration went about this decision-making initially. And now it's retreated from a clearly unconstitutional position, which is mandating institutions to violate their conscience, to saying, well, we're going to mandate institutions to support the viability and profits of corporations that are mandated by federal law to engage in direct relationships with their employees to violate their conscience, as though that's a massive change in the law. Okay, it is. I don't get that.
Try to say that again.
I'm happy to, but that's the policy. They're essentially because those institutions exist, they are then required to engage in a relationship with corporations, with companies that provide insurance, that are mandated by the federal government to engage in a direct relationship with the employees of those institutions to violate the conscience of those institutions. I think it's clearly, it's on its face unconstitutional, given the reality of the Hosanna Tabor decision, which was made immediately before the administration announced its view. I don't think it's even a close call when it comes to constitutional law. And the process by which the administration made this decision was not just negligent, but offensive.
Okay. Lots more we can talk about up here, but let's collect several more questions. Unfortunately, we have to finish up at 6 o'clock, but I hope you'll engage in a wider, more informal conversation afterwards. Let's take one question in the last row there, and then question up here, and third question right there. Okay.
Okay, Steve Winters, local researcher. I'd like to address this. Of course, there are going to be several questions to EJ.
Just one question, please. Yeah.
It's one question.
All right.
However, the position of one leading Catholic authority is this: if the government can tell us we can't obey our religious consciences while we carry out our Christian mandate to serve the needy in society, whether they're Christian or not, then he asked, what limit is there to what the government can tell us we can't do? Where is the limit to the government's power? So, EJ, you suggested that, or there was a worry, you said, you had a worry that the bishops, by getting involved in culture wars, lawsuits, Fortnight for Freedom.
I didn't actually use the word culture wars yet, I think. That wasn't my word, but anyway.
So
you did mention the Fortnight for Freedom.
Anyway,
so,
go ahead.
So, yeah,
I'm
okay,
sorry.
so the question is, Jesus, don't tell me. You said your worry was this is going to sap the energy of the church, which should be devoted to social justice causes, and get it involved in cultural wars, this, that, this, that. But the whole point is the bishops say they're doing this just because they have to do it because they aren't able to carry out their mandate for social justice under the current circumstances. So how can you possibly come to that conclusion, that this is going to sap their energies? They're doing it for the very purpose to preserve their ability to help serve the needy.
Okay, thank you. We'll just collect a few more. There's a fellow just right in front of him. There we go.
Hi, Farr Curlin, University of Chicago. I just would love to hear you guys comment on, refresh off the North Carolina marriage amendment vote and the president's comments about gay marriage, and would love to hear your comments about how that's going to affect the religious vote.
Very good. Let's take two more, one here in the first row and then over here in the third row.
Okay, Jerry Filto with National Catholic Reporter. One thing that has not been brought to the fore in the HHS regulations is the fact that the regulation explicitly models itself after state laws. There are 28 mandate laws in states in this country. And it seems to be modeled most particularly after California, 1999, which was challenged to that by Catholic Charities of Stockton, was struck down or defeated by the Supreme Court, California Supreme Court.
It was upheld, the mandate.
The mandate was upheld, but the challenge was denied. Yeah. And so I'd like, in light of the fact that, at least at the state level, some of these mandates with that narrow language has been upheld. What does that mean with regard to the HHS mandate?
Okay, and a final question here, right there.
Carol Hamrin, affiliated with George Mason.
Speak up.
It seemed to me that Obama's comments about same-sex marriage were in the realm of moral leadership, the role of the presidency as a moral leader. He said it's up to the states to decide the issue legally. And this is just his opinion. And he interestingly chose between two things he claims to value, which are biblical moral standards and human rights or equal rights. And he chose on the side of equal rights. And it seems to me that this really captures the picture of our cultural slide toward favoring individual equal rights over biblical or moral values that are good for the society, the whole culture. And so we get into a slippery slope in terms of defining who has what kind of rights, what kind of rights, who has a right to marriage and so forth. So I'd like you to address that role of moral leadership in the context of this election.
All right, we have several questions there, and I would note that that has been a point of some discussion and contention within the Catholic Evangelical dialogue, the question of same-sex marriage, equal rights for gays, tensions between the extension of civil rights and full social equality on the one hand, and the prerogatives of religious institutions. And before the contraception issue came along, this was something that the U.S. bishops were pushing as a religious freedom question as well. So I'm glad that those issues were raised here. We've got just a few minutes left, but enough time for you to address what you've heard here, but also throw in some concluding remarks, perhaps address issues that have been raised that you haven't had a chance to speak to so far. Why don't we start at the other end this time with EJ and end up with Peggy?
Isn't that what we did the last time?
No, we started with Peggy, didn't we?
He wants to have the last word.
Yeah, no, I'm happy. I want to just have as little time as possible to answer the gentleman's
All right.
hard question. No, that's, go ahead. You want me to start?
Yeah, why don't you
Yeah.
start? Yeah.
Let me just first answer the gentleman's question. Well, by the way, on the legal matter, I think actually the California court cases raise a question for Mike, which is what the administration did is patently unconstitutional when it has been upheld. Now, I will acknowledge the Ninth Circuit is not the same as the United States Supreme Court. And I could imagine the U.S. Supreme Court going the other way, but I don't think it's as open and shut because, as Kathy Cavany said in the previous session, if you are going to have a national health law, you are going to have a set of benefits that are going to be defined as part of it. The vast majority of Americans believe that contraception is a legitimate part of a health plan. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect that most health plans in America cover contraception as part of their coverage, and the ones that don't are exceptional. So I don't think it was radical for the administration as a general proposition to say that contraception should be covered. I believe that as a matter of a legitimate accommodation, and because I didn't like defining the church's religious mission solely in terms of, if you will, cultic activity, I didn't like saying that, as John Carr has said eloquently, that the church taking care of the poor or the left out was not part of its religious mission. So that, which is why I've pushed for the accommodation that they eventually came to. When I was talking about but I do not think that indirectly allowing employees at Catholic institutions, many of whom are not Catholic, to get contraception through some third party is some terrible violation of the church's religious liberty. I think the church could face all kinds of lawsuits the other way around from employees who aren't Catholic asking why cannot we who work in this hospital or in this university not get contraception coverage. And as Peggy said, plenty of Catholic institutions included as part of their health plans. I think abortion is a different matter, and the healthcare law, I believe clearly, did not cover abortion as part of the healthcare law. And to the gentleman, I was only saying that when I say sap the energy of the church, I was not talking about all the good work the church does through Catholic Charities and the hospitals and other organizations. I was talking about its public preaching, its prophetic role, where I am worried that the religious liberty talk will make social justice a much smaller part of the church's broad discussion with its people in the course of an election campaign, and which may have the effect of making the church look like it's taking one particular side in a political debate. That is what I was talking about. Just on the closing comment, the only thing I want to say is to go back to where I ended at the beginning, which is that I really do think that all of us, each of us, has to try to figure out how people who talk about religion a lot in public, who speak not in the name of their churches, but speak as people who draw some of the inspiration for how they think about politics from their faith. I think it's a real challenge to us now in this very partisan time to keep all of to try to be clear with ourselves. In a way, it's a conscience question for each of us, but it affects how these issues are discussed in public. Where does our faith stop and our party commitment begin? It's okay to have partisan or ideological commitments. It's okay to have one influenced by the other. But I am really increasingly worried in our discussion that we're passing off as religious what turn out to be partisan commitments. I love Mike's comments on Ron Sider and John Carr. But okay, the saints do a good job of it. What about the rest of us?
Thanks. Mike?
I will concede that being required to directly violate the dictates of your conscience is worse than being required to indirectly violate the dictates of your conscience. The first one was provoking talk of civil disobedience. And I think arguably, in its initial incarnation, was one of the most problematic recent efforts by the federal government on religious liberty issues. My concern, in many ways, was that the administration made this immediately after a Supreme Court decision that decided, actually unanimously, Hosanna Tabor, that recognized a broad religious autonomy right when it came to the church determining its own missions and who represented it. So a broad deference to the ability of churches to determine that. I don't think it's just beside the point to say it matters who gets to determine what a religious institution is. Because this would be a way for the federal government to essentially define away all religious liberty rights in various settings. If they can determine what a religious institution is and what it isn't, rather than having a deference to the institutions themselves in making that determination. And that strikes me as a very, very important principle. I will only touch on the issue of gay marriage because I don't believe that it will be as determinative in the long run in these debates, except as part of a cumulative case. If you look at the generational shift that's gone on from on the issue of gay marriage in a very short amount of time, we're moving in dramatically in one direction on that issue. And if you compare that, for example, to abortion, those numbers haven't shifted very much. And then, so the question is, well, why is abortion remain such a deeply divisive issue on this? And why does the gay marriage issue seem to be shifting so quickly? So, for example, from the first edition of American Grace, you know, the book by Robert Putnam and David Campbell, where they talked about the figure on support for gay marriage among those 18 to 29 or whatever, it was in the low 50s. In the second edition of the book, it was in the low 60s. Okay? That's in the course of a few years in the publishing of the second edition. And so I think that maybe what we need to concentrate in is why that issue seems to be so different than other issues like abortion. Where abortion, you are pitting, you know, the right to life against the exercise of liberty. But those arguments about basic sympathy for those who are vulnerable has a tremendous power in America that an argument over the definition of legal rights as it concerns marriage doesn't seem to have. So I think that both evangelicals and Catholics are going to have to take that seriously. You know, that this is a dramatic shift and in a short amount of time taking place on this issue, even within religious communities.
Could I say 15 seconds, because I didn't mean to duck the... I broadly agree with everything Mike just said on gay marriage. I think there is an enormous shift going on. It comes from, and it's true of religious young people as well as non-religious young people. There's a good PRRI study of this. And it has a lot to do with the length of time that gay people have been out of the closet, the number of people, Americans, who have discovered that someone they love and care about a lot is gay. And that the demand for gay marriage in a curious kind of way is actually a deeply conservative demand, because it's a demand, it's certainly a communitarian demand, because it's a demand to be able to make a commitment to fidelity and to family. And it resonates, it begins to resonate with a lot of people. So it's both a rights issue and a kind of demand for a kind of responsibility. And I think it's so striking that the issue already is playing out so differently in the 2012 election than the 2004 election. And the fact that we didn't bring it up ourselves suggests just how much it has changed as an issue in the religious sphere.
Thank you. Now, you do have the last word, Peggy. Yeah.
I think I will only say about the mandate issue is that whatever one thinks about the principled or not principled objection to the regulations, I think the bishops are pursuing a very risky strategy. And I think everything we have said today about the generational shift, about people's political shifts, et cetera, and where people ultimately get their values. It seems to me in many ways they may feel they are working to save those values. From my perspective, I think they are running a great risk of absolutely decimating whatever authority and credibility they have left, especially among, let me just say, younger Catholics of whatever persuasion they may be. And I think that's a very, very sad day for the Church. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for stimulating conversation. There was some concern beforehand that we might all agree too much, but I think we were able to sharpen some of the issues with your help. Thank you all for coming out on a Wednesday afternoon. Thanks to our panel.